It was because of the pipes. I know that now. My little corner of the art department that no one wanted to sit in, the one far away from any light source. It was just that it was small and cramped. It was that the pipes in the building ran up the wall and overhead. They made a clanging sound when the temperature changed or when a valve was turned somewhere. But it wasn't something I thought I should find annoying. After all, our apartment was nothing but slow creaking noises, the constant adjusting of the building's foundation. I always kind of thought when I was little that the apartment was alive, that it was breathing and sighing, cold in the winter and sweating in the summer. So the pipes making the odd noises as I sat and worked in my corner that night really didn't even make me blink. Didn't make me look up. Until they did. It started with a bang, like the saying, but this time literally. I was hunched over, working on perspective, drawing lots of lines. It wasn't going too well, it had been a long day and I was tired, but I was determined. I'd stayed late after everyone else had left, determined to get this right. And every time I got a little tired or bored, I had this vision of Mr. Drew pushing me over the edge of the catwalk. Yeah, maybe that wasn't exactly the best thing to see, and maybe folks would say he had a strange way of motivating staff, but I sure as heck didn't think he'd meant it that way. After all, we'd gone out to dinner last week, talked like real friends, it was a joke. That's all. But still, it did work. It'd shaken me up, refocused me, and so there was a moment I was drifting, my eyes getting a little heavy, when suddenly I imagined that I was falling toward the floor of the stage, and at the exact moment I hit it, a loud, forceful bang clanged over my head. It threw me back so far in my chair, I almost tipped over. My heart was pounding, and as the shadows in the art department became clear again in my vision, I really couldn't tell if I'd imagined the sound or if it had been real. Until it happened again. I stood up instinctively. This wasn't a furnace feeling frustrated. This was something else. What it was, though, I had no idea. Well, the one thing I did know was that it was none of my business, so I sat back down and focused on my paper. That's when the moaning started. It wasn't like wind in trees or like the creak of floorboards when a neighbor needs to use the bathroom. It was like an animal, like when a starving dog howls in the alley. But not like that exactly. Like that, but also like when a cat sees an enemy and releases that sound from deep inside its gut. And maybe also the hint of a single low note played on a violin. It was not like anything I'd heard before, and I was curious. I also remembered what Mr. Drew had said, that taking initiative was important. It was late, dark outside in the summer late. Others had gone home, and Miss Lambert had to turn the lights back on when she realized I was still here. I was doing it on purpose, of course, to show Mr. Drew and everyone that I had drive, and with that in mind, if I was the only one left in the building and something strange was going on in Mr. Drew's studio, this studio that meant so much to him, then surely it was my duty to investigate. I sat for a quiet moment, listening. Then there was that determined banging noise again, and I was up on my feet. I wasn't going to overthink this, I was just going to do it, even if it creeped me out a little. I wasn't exactly sure where to start, but I figured the furnace room was as good a place as any, and I made my way over to the elevator. As I descended into the basement, I realized just how alone I was. Each floor was empty, a single light lit, deep shadows otherwise. Maybe this was too ambitious. Maybe I had stayed too late. Too late. The basement was pitch black, and I had to feel along the wall for the light switch. The knot in my stomach eased a bit when the hall lit up, looking very normal, and I felt more confident as I walked toward the furnace room. I'd been there once before to seek out Wally the janitor because one of the toilets was overflowing. Wally had set up a makeshift kind of office down here, so that's where you found him if he wasn't making rounds. But it was after hours now, so of course when I tried the door handle, It was locked. I hadn't really thought this through. There was a loud bang again. I looked up, and only after did I realize that I'd gone too deep. It seemed the sound wasn't coming from the furnace after all, which was good news, seeing as I couldn't get access to it. Instead, it sounded like it was just above me, one floor up, and almost to confirm that thought, there was another bang right over my head. Some dust floated down toward me from the boards in the ceiling. A wail snaked its way down to me now, like the moan, but more distressed. It sounded far less like an issue with plumbing and far more like an issue with something living. That made the hairs on my arms stand up, but it also spurred me to action even more. If this was someone in trouble, not just a pipe acting up, then I needed to hurry. I needed to help. I flicked off the switch as I leapt back into the elevator. I felt nervous watching the walls drop down slowly as I rose up. As the floor of the next level materialized, I noticed my breathing was shallow, and when the elevator lurched to a stop, I was already wondering how sure I was of my plan. But I stepped out into the dark hallway and flickered on a switch. Again, the brightness made me feel a little less unsure. The wail came floating toward me again. It sounded like it was coming from farther down the hall. Knowing that I was on the right track made my stomach flip. I couldn't be sure if it was fear or excitement. Probably fear. There was something about being on the music level that could not ever make me feel anything other than uneasy. There was a loud thud. I waited. Then the moaning began again. Well, I was definitely on the right floor this time. Wasn't sure that was a good thing. As I followed the sound, I remembered my first time down here, lost in a maze of hallways. When I turned a corner and came upon a set of stairs heading downward, I felt a sense of dread pour over me. Hanging at the bottom of the stairs was a sign with the word infirmary written on it. An infirmary? Didn't know the studio had one. I walked slowly down the stairs as they creaked beneath my feet and into the infirmary's foyer. The room was fairly large with hard wooden chairs, a bed off to the corner, and a desk covered with charts against the wall. The walls were generally bare except for a yellowing poster placed without much thought near the waiting area. It was a picture of Bendy dressed as a doctor, Alice Angel in a nurse's uniform, and Boris the Wolf lying on a stretcher, with the title Bedpans and Bedlam written across it in that typical Bendy cartoon font. Crash. This time louder and coming from the hall upstairs. That shook me back into focus. I didn't know what was more unnerving, the sound itself or having no idea what the sound could possibly be. I hoped it was just some wonky plumbing. I really hoped it wasn't trespassers. I wasn't much of a tough guy, didn't think I could fend anyone off. Still, I followed the sound. I immediately switched on the lights for the hall and saw a set of doors running along each side. I waited and waited, but of course now, when I needed it, there was no sound of clanging, no wail, no nothing. I decided the only thing for it was to check out each room, if they were unlocked. Didn't trust they would be, but the first door opened, revealing a small office with some desks and a chair. I checked 2 more rooms, each the same. Then there was a bigger office. This one had a couple of framed diplomas on the wall, and now I was wondering who it belonged to. I closed the door behind me. It made a loud sound, louder than I expected, and then right away, I heard it. The wail again, but this time it was more like a cry, as if whoever it was had heard me, was alerting me. It was toward the end of the hall, behind a door, with 2 long pieces of wood crossing over the top of it, making an X, like the door was being protected from a storm or something, except of course, this door was on the inside of the building. Suddenly, something threw itself against the door. It shook. There was a large bang and a shadow appeared and then disappeared in the crack beneath the door. Definitely someone was being kept inside, or was it something? I noticed I'd been holding my breath and I let it all out now, gulping for air after I did. Something? Like an animal? Like a ghost? That was stupid. I just needed to see it with my own eyes, know that whatever it was made perfect sense. Stop my imagination from making things into a bigger deal than they were. The wail began again, this time definitely coming from behind the door. Up close there was something to it that felt different, almost sad, almost like crying, but not human crying, animal crying. It sounded helpless and I felt bad for it, about as bad as I felt scared of it. I reached down slowly and tried the door handle. It was locked, of course it was. Who would keep a door unlocked with something like that behind it? The lock should have been a sign. Not even a sign, really. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a message from a higher power. It was a locked door. And a locked door means keep out, unless you have the key. I thought about Dot. I thought about her key. It didn't seem likely that a copy of the key to this door would just be lying around anywhere. Especially not when all the other doors were unlocked. This was a room you weren't supposed to get into. I wondered. I'd never actually asked her, but the fact that Dot could just unlock a room in the basement and then a storage closet seemed to mean that this was one of those keys that could open many locks. A master key. There were a lot of thoughts running through my head in the following moments. There were worries and of course that feeling that I shouldn't be doing this, but at the same time, I can't tell you why. I felt this drive. I didn't even feel like it had anything to do with Mr. Drew anymore. I needed to sniff this out. As I found myself in the story department going through Dot's desk, I figured she'd be impressed with me and wouldn't mind me doing this. She'd probably have encouraged me if she'd been here. Probably would have brought the key along just in case a situation like this happened. And there it was, in her bottom drawer in the pages of a copy of The Complete Works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I don't remember how I made it back to the door with the X across it. I don't remember the thoughts I had. Maybe I once remembered them, but the way my mind is now, all mixed up, I don't really know. I just know that I was there, outside the door with the key. Whatever it was inside heard me again because once more it threw itself at the wood and seemed to shake the whole hallway. The wailing was more insistent now. I fit the key in the lock, and bam! Again, it threw itself against the door, threatening to shatter the whole thing and shaking me to the core. I swallowed hard. I turned the key. Click. Silence. Not even the wailing. Nothing. I took in a deep breath, turned the door handle, and pushed. The door creaked open a crack, and I pushed harder until I just decided to go for it and shove the thing wide open. I immediately flicked on the light switch. I stood there in the doorway, staring into an empty room. It was like a mini surgery, and everything was all over the place. Garbage on the floor, the bin knocked to one side, strange surgical tools were lying splayed across the counter, and a wooden chair broken into pieces was in the corner. What there didn't seem to be was anyone or anything. "Hello?" I said. That's the thing people tend to say, I've noticed, when they are unsure entering a place. Even if maybe getting a hello back is not really something you want. At this moment, I wasn't sure what I wanted, but the empty room was definitely not on the list. I entered the room cautiously and then quickly checked behind the door because that's always where people hide, behind the door. But no one was there. No one was anywhere. So I stood just in front of the open door, confused, alone, and feeling even more uneasy. I felt a shiver go up my back like a cold hand was slowly walking its fingers up my spine. That's when the lights dimmed, or I shouldn't exactly say dimmed. I'd say it was more like shadows began spilling into the room. They started slowly, so I thought maybe the light bulb was about to go out, but then I looked down and saw darkness seeping in around my feet. I picked my foot up thinking it was something wet, but it was just a shadow. Just a shadow. I looked up and watched as it crept up the walls, along the ceiling, covering the room in dripping blackness, like a room full of spilled ink. I turned around to look into the hall, and sure enough, the blackness was oozing its way out the door. I held my breath and stood very still. I was in a state of frozen panic. I'd never seen anything like this, and I didn't think anyone else probably had either. I didn't know what it meant, or how it was happening, but I did know one thing. It felt threatening, dangerous, like the dripping shadows were evil itself. I don't know how to explain what evil feels like, I just felt it. I just knew. My blood ran cold, all the light went out. In the room, in the hallway, the shadows had won and I could barely see the door frame, only a few feet in front of me. I should have just left, but fear held me rooted to the spot. Fear of the darkness, fear of the shadows, and a growing crawling fear, tickling at the back of my neck, fear that something was in the room with me. A soft, watery breathing, quiet and calm but distinct, somewhere behind me, and now I could hear the sound of scraping across the floor too, like a dragging, halting, limping footstep. Then silence. There was a sudden crash as something landed on the counter behind me, then the tinkling of metal hitting the floor. The surgical tools. I thought, sharp, precise blades on the floor. Still, I couldn't move. I had the thought that if I didn't move, if I didn't make a sound, maybe whatever it was wouldn't see me. The scraping against the floor began again. It got louder as whatever it was got closer, and then as I stood there, trying to be invisible, I could feel its presence. Not just hear it, I could feel it just behind me. It leaned in, hot, wet breath against my cheek, and then a different kind of breathy sound. Quick inhalations. It was smelling me. I wasn't invisible. I needed to run. I needed to run faster than I'd ever run in my life. Come on, buddy, run. Run. I moved toward the door, uprooting one of my feet like I was pulling it out of thick mud. I reached with my arm for the door frame to try to pull myself farther. I didn't understand. I wasn't physically stuck, but my mind was making my body act that way. The thing behind me made a strange grunting noise then, as if it had realized something. I felt it pull away from me. There was a sudden weight on my back, pushing me forward, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running past me. I'd been shoved and fell hard to the ground. It had the same force that I'd seen against the door, and it knocked the wind right out of me, but I didn't stay face to floor for long. I was up quick. Finally, my mind unstuck my feet, and I ran out into the hall after the sound of footsteps. In a daze, I looked up and down. One side was a dead end, the other was the corridor that led back to the waiting area. There was nothing. I ran down toward the main desk and skidded to a stop in front of it. Again, nothing. It was then that I noticed the brightness around me, the lack of inky shadow. I turned around, and sure enough, the hall was brightly lit too. Panting slightly, I walked slowly back to the room. No shadows. Nothing. I rubbed my hands together, realizing now they stung from the fall, and noticed the torn knee in my trousers. Now I was one shirt and 2 sets of trousers down. I only had the shirt on my back that was clean and put together enough for work. That shouldn't have bothered me just then, out of all things, but it did. A wave of exhaustion wrapped my fear up in a hug. Wandering through New York City at night, my only thought was to get home. Staring into the dark shadows down alleys and through grated storefronts, I felt a sense of dread, unlike anything I'd ever known. I didn't understand what had just happened. Nothing had been in that room, and yet something had been breathing on me, had pushed me. Had it been a trick of the mind? Was I that tired? Had I fallen? Had I tripped over myself? It wouldn't have been the first time. Clown feet, they'd teased me in school. But what about the sounds? The rattled doors, the growing shadows? That had been real. More than real. Those shadows were alive. I was pretty sure. Breathing, existing. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a lie. I had heard sounds. I had seen the door shake, and I had been pushed to the floor. All of that had happened. I knew it had. I wasn't going to doubt my mind. I was so sure of my mind back then. I remember that feeling. It's almost like I'm feeling that feeling again. I walked all the way home. It took me just over an hour, but I needed it. I needed the time to settle my nerves, to get into that familiar rhythm, to see other people just being people and not being nightmares. The shadows stalked by me, but I was a fast walker, and by the time I got home, the dread was very small and the exhaustion had taken over. This was good, I just needed to sleep. I climbed up the stairs and slumped into our darkened apartment. Everyone had gone to bed. Good, I didn't feel like talking with my grandfather or trying to make Ma feel like everything was okay. I carefully opened the door to my room so that I didn't wake the old man. Lying there on his side of the bed with the streetlight illuminating his face, he looked almost like a corpse. I wondered if he was breathing. I couldn't help myself. I held a hand over his nose and mouth and felt a slight warm air against it. Thank goodness for that. I sat down on my side of the bed, facing the closed door, and had an image again of the locked door at the studio. No, I shook my head. I wasn't thinking about that anymore that night. I slowly pulled the suspenders from my shoulders and rolled them back, arching my neck and hearing a very satisfying crack. I sighed. Then something grabbed me hard from behind. I leapt up with a cry and turned to see my grandfather sitting up, staring at me with those hollow eyes, wide and haunting. His mouth was open in what looked to be fear or anguish. "What?" I asked a little too loudly, but my heart was racing fast. "What is it?" He raised his hand slowly and pointed right at me. "Grandfather, it's me. It's Buddy. Daniel." I placed my hand to my chest and tapped it. "It's just me, your grandson." He kept pointing, his index finger shaking slightly. His expression stayed frozen. I bent over to try to comfort him? I thought maybe he couldn't see too great, so if he could see me close up. "See, it's just me." With another sudden movement, he was holding me by my collar with both hands. His speed amazed me. He was pulling at my shirt. I could hear the seams along the shoulders starting to rip. "Stop it, grandfather, stop it!" Pulling back only made it worse, and his long skeletal fingers only grabbed tighter. "Stop it!" "Off!" he said hoarsely. "What?" He managed to finally pass a button through a buttonhole. You must see. He was determined now, but I finally understood and I placed my hands over his shaking ones. He wouldn't let go, and as I tried to stand upright, I relented and unbuttoned my shirt as I did. He kept pulling at me until finally I could flail my arms out of my sleeves, disentangling myself from the fabric and staggering back toward the door. Grandfather held the shirt in his lap and looked at it. I stared at him, wide-eyed in my yellowing undershirt. "What is wrong with you, old man?" I wanted to shout it, but didn't want to wake Ma, so I whispered it through a hiss. "Look," said my grandfather. I looked down at myself. All I saw was me, and the hole in the knee of my trousers. "No, Kozula." I looked up. He held my shirt bundled in his lap, and then, with aged, shaking hands and pencil-thin fingers, he held my shirt up for me to see. And I saw. And I stared. "Look," said my grandfather. The light from outside shone through the shirt, making it see-through, making it so I could see the back of the shirt easily, so that I could make out the dark shadow imprint on it. I reached out and took the shirt from him. He let me have it easily. "You see," said my grandfather, sounding satisfied and laying back against the pillow. A handprint, exactly where I had been pushed. On the back of my shirt, a large, black, ink-stained handprint.